Hey everyone, long time no see. I know it's been a while since I posted a video. I've been a bit busy getting into a new job, and also I've had my projects on the in the works. I've carried on plugging away with You Can Hear Chopin, and obviously the Dale Hurst Writing Show. My podcast has taken up a lot of my time as well. So yeah, there's been a lot going on. I apologise, by the way, for how it looks on this video. That we are lacking the usual bookshelf background, etc., etc. But the lighting wasn't brilliant. I know it's not perfect now. We're looking to get that fixed. Um, but yeah, amid all of this and obviously everything that's going on in the world at the moment, I just wanted to send a quick message and offer a little Christmas treat in form of a preview of something that people have been asking me a lot about. Actually, the question frequently being asked is there going to be a third Berylford scandal? The answer to that question is yes, there is. There was always going to be. The two that have been published, Lust and Liberty and Sin and Secrecy, there was always plan. I always had plans to release a third instalment, and then there would be various offshoots of those stories, some of which don't even concern the characters with which some of you are already familiar. Well, to give you a bit of context, I guess, a couple of years ago, a few different stories I heard from friends and family, and just through my research as well, they culminated into what I decided would be a Berylford scandal, not necessarily the definitive third installment in the series. I combined this with research into sort of the gothic horror novels of the Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker ilk, and that led me to consider that if I were to do this as a Berylford book, I would like to sort of combine the crime elements with the horror, to sort of put a different spin on the Berylford books that you already know. So, but still keeping the Dickensian flavour, of course. So I planned it, kept planning it and working on it, and we now actually have part of a first draft of a first chapter. So as a Christmas treat, I'm going to. There's a reading that follows this, which is of that first incarnation of the first chapter of what will be known as the Berylford Scandals, the Tenant of the Bishop's Candle. So that is to say that this is not a Berylford scandal directly following on from Sin and Secrecy, or indeed leading into Lust and Liberty. Is neither a prequel or a sequel, it is an offshoot, a spin-off, if you will. So here it is, here's me reading the first snippet of The Tenant of the Bishop's Candle. Tentative title, of course.
Very few who ever had cause to pass between the Hampshire towns of Berylford and Wraxhill on the Test would have thought to stop off at the Bishop's Candle. It was much better suited to travellers coming to or from the cities to the north or the ports to the south as an overnight stopping point. While there was nothing overly luxurious or compelling about its exterior, or anything that suggested a particularly inviting atmosphere, the inn received continuous, regular custom. Rooms could be taken sometimes for weeks on end. It was all the same to the sole permanent occupant of the topmost rooms, the landlady, Mrs. Zillah Jablow. One-night visitors and long-term residents at the inn thought the same thing about Mrs. Jablow, that woe betide any who dared to cross her. She had been plain as a girl, and this had only extended into her dotage, her nose long and thin, her hair black and grey wires, the receding hairline now hidden by an ill-fitting lace cap, her teeth misshapen, and her long fingers like eagle's talons, whether sitting at her desk in her counting-house, which doubled as a lounge, or on her settee enjoying her fill of cake and sherry, she was stance in a painful arch. The same routine was observed each morning. At 10, not a moment before or after, came a knock on the counting-house door. Yes, Percy, was Mrs. Jablow's prickly answer, to which a boy of 15 entered the room. With his lean build and mature face, one might have suspected him of being older. He came armed with a tray on which sat a set of tea-things, a plate of seed-cake, and a decanter of rich purple liquid. Percy placed this tray down, and set the various objects on the low table before where Mrs. Jablow was hunched. She at once tapped the decanter a couple of times with her pen, which let out a faint chime. "You take that back down with you, Percy," she said, or that good-for-nothing wretch my sister married will sniff it out in no time. Don't know what he thinks he's done to deserve it." "Understood, Mrs. Jablow. Were they downstairs when last you looked?" "Mr. and Mrs. Veldstone were, yes." Mrs. Jablow let out a husky scoff while pouring herself a cup of tea. "Having their fill at my expense, no doubt," she said. "Their portions certainly weren't sparing, madam. In that case—" She lurched forward and lifted the lid off the seed cake and plunged an adjacent knife straight down the middle. The soft, crumbly brown sponge clung to both sides of the blade. Once she had sliced the cake in half, she lifted one side onto another plate and handed the remaining half back to Percy. "You may take that back down to the kitchen as well. That'll teach them to stuff their faces with my food before presuming upon my time to receive further refreshment." "Very good, madam." Percy took a step back. "Will there be anything else?" "Rouse the Misses Veldstone if you don't see them on your way back downstairs. The only joy I get from this wretched ritual is seeing my nieces." "Understood." "And Percy," Mrs. Jablow called as her servant made back for the door. He turned, but only inclined his head upwards slightly. She beckoned him forward. "Open your mouth," she said. His brow furrowed, looking uncertain. She presented a single finger of shortbread, which she snapped in half and placed between his teeth. "There's a good lad," she said. "Now run along and don't tell anyone I gave you that." She watched him as his face flushed with pure bliss at the sugary, buttery biscuit dissolving in his mouth. Her eyes narrowed to a squint, silently pressing for the thanks that he had thus far forgotten to give. Not that he had the chance, for 3 sharp knocks came from the door behind him moments later. Mrs. Jablow's mouth formed a grim M shape, and she directed her glare away from Percy to the table. "That'll be them," she murmured. "Let them in, Percy." She did not look up while the servant opened the door to a man of nearly 6½ feet, whose belly protruded a good 4 or 5 inches in front of him, with his arms behind his back, in a manner that suggested he was not in the habit of being kept waiting. He swaggered into the lounge counting-house, having to slouch to prevent his golden-haired head from bashing into the beams above. Behind him crept a woman who could have fit inside him 3 times, such was her stick-thin build. A worrisome expression was held behind a pair of large wire-rimmed spectacles and a lopsided cap, out of which draped fly-away, greying dark hair. "Mr. and Mrs. Veldstone, madam," Percy announced midway out of the door, not allowing time for Mrs. Jablow to stop him. Her eyes were already fixed on Mr. Veldstone, who had sat on one of the empty armchairs opposite her and reclined back so far that his head was almost against the window-pane. She continued to glare at him, even when Mrs. Veldstone had bent down to bid her a barely audible good morning, sister, and peck her on the cheek. "Only half a seed cake," Mr. Veldstone observed. "What's happened to the other half, then, Zillah? Stuffed it away for later, have you, like the last mince pie at Christmas?" "Never you mind what's happened to the other half, Mr. Veldstone. And that's Mrs. Jablow to you. I don't recall permitting you to use my Christian name. Mrs. Jablow, indeed. To entertain the thought that there had ever been a Mr. Jablow beggars belief. Did you starve him to death as you mean to do your sister and I?" "Mr. Jablow enjoyed a merry diet in life, I'll have you know," said Mrs. Jablow, her lips twisted into a crooked smile. "It was apoplexy and ruin that did for him."